So last week, I got a phone call from the nephew of a man named Richard Vito, aka Biff, who you will meet in the video which follows this. This video and the circumstances that Mr. Biff, Mr. Vito, found himself in was the result of a conversation he had with police. This conversation ended up landing him in jail for 15 days for a crime that he had nothing to do with.
I can imagine how many innocent senior citizens are in jail because of these cops.
And highlights the importance of not speaking to people who are not looking out for your best interest or are trying to work against you somehow. Him and his nephew came in today to consult about a possible false arrest claim against the police department for an investigation that they did that landed Mr. Vito in jail ultimately for 15 days before he was fully exonerated and all the charges against him were dropped. Just as important as not talking to police, as you have the right to remain silent, it's also important to not have conversations without your lawyer present or through your lawyer with third-party insurance adjusters, because these kinds of problems can get just as ugly for a potential case if you're having a discussion with people like that as well. The circumstances surrounding his arrest were stolen items from a warehouse, right? So when an investigation like that's going on, there's usually a lot of hearsay and people talking, right? And that in this particular case, there was a criminal informant involved in the investigation, and that led to the police showing up at Mr. Vito's house and interrogating him about what transpired at the warehouse. So as it turns out, Mr. Vito, as he's 77 years old, he has memory problems. Doesn't look 77, but he is. He can confirm that. He gets approached by two cops at his home. He, now that he's retired, sells junk from time to time. That's how he earns a little pocket money, right? And so the cops come up his driveway and start asking him questions about this warehouse that he had been at previously. He bought a few cars off the guy who owned the warehouse and a few other different goods for him to sell and trade in the junk business. And that same warehouse had been robbed multiple times by, as it turns out, the criminal informant who was blaming it on Mr. Vito and a friend of his. Neither of them were involved in any of the theft, which bore itself out as the case progressed. What Mr. Vito said to the police gave them what's called probable cause to file charges against him, just based on his statement alone. And that probable cause ultimately would defeat a civil case that was pursued against law enforcement for any kind of case you could think to bring, basically false arrest, false imprisonment, that kind of thing, because he did spend 15 days in jail, and he's a 77-year-old who never committed a crime in his life, never even had a parking ticket.
Nothing.
But the message that I want everyone to take away from this is the danger of agreeing to talk candidly with police or anybody who doesn't have your best interest in mind, that can then turn around and leverage your statements against you later, which is exactly what happened to Mr. Vito, what landed him in jail for 15 days, and also ultimately now why he doesn't have a very strong civil case against law enforcement for what ended up happening to him in his criminal case, even though the charges were all thrown away. And he is getting questioned by this cop about this warehouse and being at it, which he had been at it. He's a 77-year-old man, also, like we said, who suffers from time to time memory loss. And he's getting interrogated by these cops aggressively. They're asking him questions, and he makes a statement which is contained in the affidavit of probable cause, which is the narrative written up by the cop after the investigation, which justifies filing criminal charges against, in this case, Mr. Vito. Charges that were later dropped after he ended up spending 15 days in prison wrongfully. And the quote, which is in the affidavit of probable cause, that the cop wrote down and said Mr. Vito made, is this: "I was the driver and knew what Mr. Howard was going to do when they both got to the warehouse, but I didn't take nothing." So that's the quote, right? As it turns out, what Mr. Vito meant when he made this statement was not at all what it ended up being twisted into becoming in the affidavit of probable cause, which formed the basis for the charges to be filed. What he meant was, me and Mr. Howard, the guy who he was with and doing business with, drove to the warehouse together, met the owner, purchased items from the owner on multiple other occasions. They had an existing business relationship, and the cops were haranguing him and repeatedly asking him questions, asking him in different ways. I think most people understand through movies and TV shows and whatever, the way cops tend to ask questions. They're very aggressive. Mr. Vito was frustrated and said what he said, meaning I did go with him and I didn't steal anything. That's what he meant when he said what he said. Now, this statement, unfortunately, tanks, in my opinion, the ability for him to recover on a false arrest claim. This officer, if he was brought to court on a civil case against that Mr. Vito brought against him, he would be able to say on the stand in front of a jury, this is what Mr. Vito said to me. I reasonably interpreted his statement to give me probable cause because he was involved in the theft. And as I read the quote, I'm sure you can gather, a jury would say it was reasonable under the circumstances, even though the cop turned out to be wrong after the fact. It doesn't matter what happened after the fact. He had a reasonable basis to believe it when he made the statement to bring the charges forward. He was, in a lot of ways, psychologically traumatized, understandably, from the circumstances, and kept saying that he was framed.
My doctor told me what happened to you in jail is a crime.
And the emotional damage that exists within Mr. Vito now is obvious to anyone that has a conversation with him. And I tried explaining to him a bunch of different ways why the cop having probable cause based on the statements that he made it so that he didn't have a civil case against law enforcement. So again, this is a classic and really horrifying example of what can happen when you are being pressured by police to answer questions and you start trying to have a conversation with them in good faith. So, Mr. Vito, you want to add anything? You sure? You feel like that was a fair?
I don't know what to add,
Yeah.
The cop was wrong. That's all I could say. He just didn't believe that the owner of the warehouse was standing right next to us. And they gave me a felony because I told him, ask the owner what happened. He's standing right next to me. What's his name? And I just couldn't remember his name, so they gave me a felony for it because they said, well, if you can't remember his name, he wasn't here.
Yeah.
And he was there.
And obviously through their
And I got witnesses that will say he was there.
As the investigation moved forward and you ended up in jail over the whole thing, they did discover that you were innocent and let you free.
The DA came right down and said, and the warden, and he said, we made a big mistake, we're apologizing to you right now.
That probable cause, as it turned out to be wrong, was later pivoted and all the charges against him were dropped. The existence of that probable cause defeated any chance that he had of pursuing a civil case against law enforcement in Pennsylvania. Part of the reason for that probably is that Mr. Vito is 77 years old and self-admitted has some cognitive problems. He's the one who went through what he went through, and when they went through something so horrific, they don't want to have to hear that there is no remedy. This is something I always say to clients too, like when it comes to stuff like this, if I'm turning down a case, that doesn't mean every lawyer in America is going to turn down your case. But let me explain to you the reason why I don't think it's necessarily worth it and why it's likely to fail in front of a jury. He was understanding but convinced that he was wronged, which he's not wrong about. But the reality is that the remedies available to him are very limited.
I could have bailed myself out. I had $9,000 in my debit card. They wouldn't let me do that. And I only got my meds twice and only half of them. And the only thing I was worried about when I got my meds was my prostate pill. I didn't get my medication. My doctor said that's what's keeping you alive. And you didn't get them.
And you didn't eat.
And I didn't eat. I lost 17 pounds. I went right to my doctor and he weighed me. And he said, this is all a crime.
The burden of proof is very high in cases like this. As you can imagine, law enforcement understandably has a lot of authority when it comes to arresting bad guys. And sometimes that ends up causing problems for guys like Mr. Vito. He had a hard time swallowing that pill, but we did have a good conversation and he left, I think, a little more understanding than he came in. So that's a win. What we want everybody to learn from this and take away from Biff's experience is trying to have conversations in good faith with police can often lead you into places that you never dreamed you'd end up. So it's always better to keep your mouth shut and get a lawyer as fast as you can. Thanks for coming in, guys. Sorry we don't have a civil case. We'll get you on the next one. If you like this video, follow for more.